Okay. Hi, Amy. How are you?
I'm doing all right, Douglas. How are you?
Doing fine. Thank you. Thank you for coming on the show. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. You look comfortable.
Yes, very comfortable. Okay, so right off the bat, the Spock in the room, we got to ask about that. What is the significance of Mr. Spock?
Uh, I teach grad school. I teach writing at Vermont College of Fine Arts, and so there's Spocks all over my office because when I write to my students in their first packet, when we go back and forth, I always have to kind of explain to them that I will, obviously point out the things in their pieces that are working really well, but then I'll also be talking about the questions I have about the pieces and where we can, and looking at where we can improve. And I always tell them that, I tend to be blunt and just to get, I'm not here to sugarcoat anything. And so I want them to picture me as a cuddly Vulcan. And I tell them to choose the Vulcan, that they most identify with. And so I love Spock. I think he's great. His emotion regulation is on point. So it's part I'm a Trekkie, part that I love Spock, part that I love the idea of how Vulcans recognize, pay attention to, and learn to regulate their emotions.
Well, I always wondered if they just regulated their emotions or they eliminated their emotions.
Well, that's a good question. I mean, in my viewings of any Star Trek, I think I've definitely seen them have emotions. And when they lose it, they are like, oh man, they have to go to a place and get and bring themselves back to a place. I mean, I think canon says that Vulcans are actually very emotional, and that they have learned, that they have worked hard to become rational, logical beings in
Okay.
that way.
You don't think that someone living like that would be incredibly repressed, holding it all in, and one day they're just going to explode?
I think I'd probably suspect that. Yeah, I don't think I'm like that, but I'm also not actually a Vulcan, as it turns out. My ears are not pointy, um, though I do like logic quite a bit.
Well, I mean, I agree with the idea because if you go back to even as far as the Bible, they talked about that the human emotions are the ones that are causing all the problems in the world. And there was
That's
the seven deadly sins, and I mean, we can go on that topic. But
yeah,
on the other hand, and even Star Trek pointed that out, that you lose the other side because Spock didn't laugh and he didn't cry and he didn't feel love, at least not outwardly. You know what I mean? So,
yeah, no, and that's where I think I definitely differ.
yeah.
It's honestly, to be honest with you, Douglas, in the last maybe 3 years, I have admitted openly in lectures at the college that I am not a Vulcan. In
Well,
fact,
that's good.
my main focus is on emotions in my everyday life, in my writing, in everything that I do. I like to talk to young people about emotions, because I'd like to model. Um, I'd like to model for them that their emotions are normal, that they are handleable, they can, and that they're capable of handling them, and that they're valid. I think one of the things we do with young people is that we invalidate their emotions a lot in this culture. And so I've had to come out and say, no, I'm not really a Vulcan. I sometimes just wished I was. I think that's really why I have a thing for Spock.
All right. Well, so you're also an award winning author, and the book we're going to be talking about today is Attack of the Black Rectangles. I did look at the cover, and it looked like one of those redacted sort of speeches or documents that the FBI puts out and says, here, this is from the Freedom of Information Act. And all you have is hello and sincerely. So
Yeah.
this was from a personal experience you had with, was it your children?
It was my youngest son. Yeah.
Okay, tell us that story.
It was pretty simple. He went to school, and everything was going great. And they got time for sort of their last reading assignment of the year, which was in what they call a literature circle. And every little group was going to be reading a different book. And he brought home The Devil's Arithmetic by Jane Yolen, a fantastic novel about the Holocaust. Um, and I was working in my office when it was downstairs, and I'm like, hey, how was your day? And he's like, oh, it was great. And then he goes to do his homework, and then he says, hey, Mom, there are some words crossed out in this book. And I said, oh, because I'm a very trusting person. I'm like, oh, is it pen or pencil? Somebody was just being silly. And he said, no, it's in Sharpie. And we all of our books have it. And I said, bring that book to me right now. And so I had a look at it. And I took, actually, I can show you because I have them here. I took 2 pictures. And most of my friends on social media are librarians or teachers. And so I was able to quickly pop on to Facebook and ask if anyone had a copy of The Devil's Arithmetic around. And indeed, within a minute, we knew what the words were that were crossed out. And then began my attempt to try and solve the problem, which for me was pretty easy, again, because other people on my social media happened to work for the company that released that book, and they offered a class set to replace the censored ones, et cetera, et cetera. My independent bookstore offered to pulp the books so that, they wouldn't be in circulation, et cetera. And I was expecting sort of some recognition to any of it, but what actually happened was they looked at me like I was nuts, like this was totally normal, totally acceptable, and I shouldn't really be worrying about it. And so I tried a good few times and then had to walk away from, I wasn't going to win that one, so it's no big deal in a way. I mean, immediately I bought an uncensored copy for my son so he could read it that way. But yeah, I don't want to say I lost so much because it wasn't that much of a fight. This was 2018. Book censoring wasn't really in our everyday the way it is now. So that was the story. I didn't really get a good outcome or any outcome as far as I knew. No one had kept me up to date on what happened, so I decided to write a better outcome.
Okay, let me ask you something. Was this live ink, I know to use an industry term, or was it printed that way with the words crossed out?
No, it was Sharpie. It was someone Sharpied it. I did find out who Sharpied it, and I found out why, and that's in the book. But or at least the idea of why, we'll say.
My point is somebody at your son's school library actually grabbed the books and crossed them all out.
Yeah, it was the teacher.
Okay, they didn't come that way from the publisher is what I'm saying.
No.
No, okay, Mm-mm. Okay. Do you want to tell us what was crossed out?
Yeah, I will. I don't have any problem with that at all. It was, I should give background real quick. The first censorship is right in the middle of one of the most harrowing concentration camp scenes, age appropriate, that I've ever read. Well, maybe not ever read, but pretty hard. It was a shower scene, 12-year-old girls, and the shower had gone on and off. They were obviously naked, and the soldiers were all around them, and they were screaming at them in a foreign language. And so the first line says, it's just a phrase. It said that that the main character covered her breasts as she walked out of the room. And so covering her breasts is the first thing that was crossed out. And the second was a vague mention to a similar thing. The sentence was, she motioned to her own undeveloped chest.
It's always about sex, isn't it? Every time I see people upset about books in schools, it's always about sex. And it brings up the argument that what is age appropriate for children? Okay. And I think there can be a long debate on this because on the one sense, I think a lot of people would not want their children exposed to hardcore pornography. But at the same time, there are the arguments about, well, I'd rather have my children watching a film with 2 people making love than 2 people trying to kill each other. Violence seems to be a lot more acceptable. In other words, if that line had been one of the soldiers took a bayonet and stabbed the girl in the shower, it probably would not have been censored.
Well, the book does have plenty of violence in it. It's about the Holocaust, and no, none of those sentences were crossed out. I agree with you that we accept violence far more readily than we accept sex, but I'm going to take it back to, wait a second. Since when is the word breasts about sex? It's not. It's an anatomical word, first of all, and it's there to feed a beautiful baby.
Exactly.
That's what breasts are. And so we sexualize them in our culture, yes. And so immediately when somebody says breast, it becomes sexualized. But it's not. It's the same as an elbow. I mean, as someone who grew breasts, I can say there was no, it wasn't sexual as much as it was biological, really.
The Europeans have a much better approach to that in the sense that they don't equate nudity with sex. But we as Puritans derived from the English, our foundings and our culture is based on that idea that nudity equals sex.
Yeah, I lived in Europe as well for a little more than 10 years, and I had a relative visit me, and they had a commercial on one time for toilet paper, and it was the tagline was "Love your bum," right? And so what it did, but right before it said "Love your bum," it showed it was probably a 15-second spot, and it was just all different types of bums, and it was just bums, and my relative nearly fell over. That she couldn't believe that there were bums on the screen, and I was like, it's just a toilet paper commercial, because I got used to it. I didn't ever expect to move back to America from Ireland, but I did. So, but yeah, they're very good at that separation, and I'm not. Yeah, I suppose it is the Puritan angle over here. I don't understand. I think it's Puritan. It's also it might be actually tied into the capitalism too. I mean, look, they can't sell me stuff that I don't need if I don't feel small, and why not use my own body against me? And I mean, as a woman, I'm 52 years old, and I've had my body used against me since, like probably fourth grade. Well, that's just how it goes.
It's a two-way street with capitalism, because at the same time, they'll put a bikini-clad woman on the hood of a car that they're trying to sell.
Amen.
So
yes, they will.
Yeah.
Yes, they will.
It works both ways. Okay, so we've only got a couple minutes left. Just quickly, so Attack of the Black Rectangles is a sort of fictionalized version of what you had explained, yeah?
Yeah, it is. Mac Delaney is a sixth grade boy. He has two good friends, Marcy and Dennis. They're the ones who take on what I was just describing, sort of that fight, we'll say. But then at home, Mac has other issues. Or other things going on. He's got a mom. His granddad lives in the basement. In a flat in the basement, and he has a difficult relationship with his estranged father. But all in all, really, it's about kind of talking to young people about standing up for what they know their rights are, because they're really tired of getting talked down to. Douglas, if I can tell you anything about my last decade or more in schools, talking to young people, as candidly as we're talking today. When people say, "Oh, you shouldn't see this, you shouldn't look at this, you shouldn't," it really underestimates them. It undermines their education, undermines their intelligence, it undermines their ability to have their own critical thinking. So so that's what the book's about. It gives some solutions. I live just across the river from Central York School District, where there was a giant list of banned books beginning of the school year. And it was the students who were finally able to solve that problem. And that was they're all disturbing lists, but this was a specifically very racist and homophobic. That tends to be the usual focus, right? But it was a very racist move on that district's part. So really glad that those students worked as hard as they did and spoke out. And that's what I do for a living. I tell young people that their voice is important, and I want to lift them up and get them to use their voice and vote.
I like that. I think that's great. Amy, we are out of time. We do have to wrap this up. Thank you so much for coming on. Do you have a website that you want to give out?
Oh, yeah. You can find me at as-king.com.
as-king.com. Okay. And there's links there to your book, where to buy it, and
links to everything there, all kinds of fun stuff. Yeah. For teachers listening, there's downloadable worksheets, activity sheets, things like that as well. So.
Okay. Well, thank you for coming on the show. It was nice meeting you. Pleasure talking to you. Best of luck with your book. I hope it does well.
Thank you. And thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.